Boom. All right. As y'all see, I'm here with Mr. Jeremy R. Hammond. But before we dive into the conversation, I got to tell y'all about Expat Money Summit. That's expatmoneysummit.com is the world's largest offshore event taking place entirely online October 7th through 11th, put on by Mikkel Thorup, host of the Expat Money Show and a highly sought after expat consultant with over 2 decades of experience. Discover why international diversification is a must for those looking to preserve their liberty and wealth. Learn everything you need to know about crafting your perfect plan B, how to quickly acquire a second passport, diversify your finances offshore, invest in international real estate, and get in-depth insights on geopolitics from world-renowned experts. Headline speakers include Dr. Ron Paul, Doug Casey, Scott Horton, Tom Woods, Mark Faber, Tom Luongo. To reserve your complimentary ticket, head over to expatmoneysummit.com. Expatmoneysummit.com. It's entirely free. Just go sign up at expatmoneysummit.com and get your free tickets so you can go October 7th through 11th. We're coming in on a month, man. So get ready for expatmoneysummit.com. It's going to be a lot of fun. All right, Jeremy, what's up, bud?
Hey, Plan B sounds like a good idea.
Right? Yeah.
Hey,
Yeah,
Tommy,
plan B has a whole new meaning now.
it's great to be on your show. Thanks for having me.
Oh, no doubt, man. I've been meaning to talk to you for quite a while. I really enjoy your journalism. So, and
Appreciate it.
I'm glad you're writing at the Institute. You're doing excellent work at the Institute.
Thank you.
So, I wanted to talk about international law a little bit because we'll hear people bring up international law, especially when it relates to the war in Gaza with Israel. And there's no doubt that the things that are going on in Gaza are atrocious. And the amount of civilians being killed and the children, the women just devastating, bombing 1600-year-old churches. It's incredibly heartbreaking to see what's happening in Gaza. And a lot of people want to bring up the fact that, well, they're breaking international law and, South Africa has determined that it's a possible genocide, et cetera, et cetera. I kind of have a different take on it. I think that with the development of the liberal world order after World War II and just the the power that the United States holds over the world order, it determines who is going to be held to account via international law. And so I think it can be kind of a waste of breath at times to shout, oh, they're breaking international law when they're acting on behalf of the United States in many of their in a lot of ways that they're acting on behalf of the United States, or they at least have cover from the United States. And so I think it's valuable to understand what international law is and the way it operates, but also kind of have a realistic view of who's going to be held to account. So I would kind of let you take it from there, kind of explain how the international law works and where maybe my thinking is flawed on it.
No, I mean, I don't see any flaws in what you've just said. First of all, I think international law is important because although we might oppose the very institution of statehood, being holding to the non-aggression principle, to me, I mean, there are libertarians who have a different view on this, but to me, if we start with the premise that you shouldn't commit aggression against anyone, then what logically follows from that is that we must oppose the state, because the state is founded in the opposite premise. It's founded on the threat or use of force to achieve ends. And we don't believe in that. We believe in voluntary exchange for mutual benefit. And so on one hand, you have this institution called the state, where they have these governments that rely on force to achieve ends according to the whims of politicians who even assuming no corruption, can only at best make arbitrary decisions about uh, how to direct scarce resources that have been forcibly expropriated from the population. So on one hand, yeah, we have this institution of statehood that we oppose. But on the other hand, if this institution of statehood is going to exist, states do exist, and so it's a good thing that they have kind of engaged in these contractual agreements, which is what international law is, um, to essentially moderate their own behavior and to limit their ability to commit crimes against each other. So in that sense, international law is a good thing. The Geneva Conventions, and principles that are espoused in the UN Charter, the acknowledgement of the right to self-determination, acknowledgements of the right to informed consent. These are all positive developments. Moving toward a civilized society, we're certainly far from that. And to me, a prerequisite to achieve a civilized humankind would be to end the institution of statehood. But as long as we have these institutions of states, it's good that there is international law. The problem is precisely as you identified, that international law is kind of applied selectively, and it's enforced selectively because of the structure of power, and primarily due to the UN system, the UN organization, which, as you kind of rightly said, so after World War II, the League of Nations was essentially replaced with the United Nations. And the League of Nations, by the way, was central, played a central role in creating the Israel-Palestine conflict, because it lended the color of law to Britain's belligerent occupation of Palestine, even though the Palestine Mandate violated the League of Nations' own charter. And so you have institutions like the League of Nations that are themselves acting unlawfully, but pretending to grant like legal authority to various actions, which in this case was pretending to grant legal authority to the Zionist project to reconstitute Palestine into a demographically Jewish state. Completely illegitimate, completely unlawful. But this is the problem. And then that was replaced by the UN, which of course you have this structure where you have the 5 permanent members, including the United States, that have this veto power, which really limits the ability of that organization to do anything effectual toward holding countries like Israel accountable. And we've seen how the U.S. Throughout the history of the UN organization, has utilized its veto power to protect Israel from international censure, and protect it from being held accountable for its crimes against the Palestinians. We saw this since 10/7. The U.S. vetoed 3 different UN ceasefire resolutions, Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire. And while arming Israel, while enabling and facilitating Israel's genocide in Gaza. And so there is this problem of, there's this thing called international law, and Israel is brazenly violating it. Brazenly violating international human rights law and international humanitarian law. The latter being essentially laws of war, that there's this concept of, just war. And essentially the only just war there is, the only legitimate use of force in international affairs is self-defense. And so war of aggression is outlawed, rightfully. And so, the first question is this use of force in international affairs just? Is it legitimate? But beyond that, there's also, okay, even if you are fighting a just war, even if a state is fighting a just war that is legitimate and in an act of self-defense, well, then there is a question of, well, how is it, are its actions within that broader context legitimate? Just because a state starts fighting a war in self-defense doesn't legitimize all the actions it takes in the pursuance of its war aims. So you can't just like indiscriminately bomb civilians. And so that's where international humanitarian law comes in. So you can, obviously states, these collectives called states, the people living in states have a right to self-defense, and they have a right to collective self-defense. Nobody really argues against that. But obviously you have to exercise that right uh, according to principles of international law. And a lot of the principles of international law rise to the level of what's called customary international law, whereas so that, just because a state might not be a party to a specific treaty that prohibits certain actions and behaviors doesn't mean that though that law does not apply to them. It's basically the statehood version of common law. We look at the Bible, and long before God handed Moses the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, it was recognized that murder was wrong. When Cain
Right.
murdered Abel, it was recognized before God had ever issued the law that that was immoral and wrong. And so that's basically common law, right? Everyone understands from their own conscience that the law is written on our minds and in our hearts. And that's common law, and that's really the parallel to that in the institution of statehood is customary international law. And so the problem is that the law is really the U.S. government will of course always cite international law. Well, Saddam Hussein is violating international law and
Right.
so on and so forth. The so-called rogue states, it's always trying to blame them for violating international law. But then when it comes to its own behaviors, it completely disregards international law. Yeah,
Yeah.
Saddam Hussein is violating international law. So we have to violate international law and commit the supreme international crime, which is war of aggression, as described at Nuremberg, the supreme international crime, to commit this war of aggression based on false pretext. I mean, it's just
How
completely
I'm
hypocritical.
sorry. I just real quick, I just want to know, like, how would, let's say the United States and the UN has comes together and puts together a charter that says Israel has broke international law, yet Israel is refusing to adhere by international standards, right? How
Mhm.
would they then uphold international law against Israel? Wouldn't that just lead to another war, a broader war?
Well, not necessarily. So this is where essentially the International Criminal Court, the ICC, comes in, which is a separate body. It's not a UN body. It's created by a separate treaty.
Hmm.
Um, and so you have the International Court of Justice, which is a UN body, which is essentially the highest authority on matters of interpretation and application of international law. That's the ICJ. But the ICJ has no authority to enforce its decisions. So the ICJ, for example, just in July ruled that Israel's occupation, not only that a multitude of aspects of Israel's occupation violate international law, but the occupation itself is illegal,
Hmm.
which was quite a positive development for the highest court in the land, sometimes called the World Court, to finally come out and say what should have been obvious and should have been said a long time ago. But then there's no enforcement mechanism within the ICJ or the UN organization apart from UN Security Councils, which of course can become ineffectual. I mean, the UN Security Council can issue a ceasefire resolution, and Israel just ignores it
Hmm.
with the support and backing of the United States government. But this is where the ICC could potentially play a positive role in moving things forward, because the ICC does have the ability to prosecute, and the prosecutor for the ICC actually issued has sought arrest warrants against Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, along with three top Hamas officials, one of whom was Ismail Haniyeh, who has since been assassinated. Um, but there's been a problem with the ICC where similarly, the ICC has had a case before it since 2014, and an investigation underway since 2014 to investigate war crimes by both Palestinian armed groups and the Israeli government.
Hmm.
And it's just been kind of sitting on its hands for all these years, and has been criticized for that. Like, why isn't it moving forward with this investigation? Why isn't it prosecuting on both sides? War criminals on both sides.
Right.
So to see this move finally from the prosecutor of actually announcing that it's seeking arrest warrants for leaders in both Hamas and the Israeli government is a positive development. But at the same time, that was a couple months ago, and nothing has happened since.
Right.
So the issues have not been, the warrants have not been issued, and it requires approval from a three-judge panel for that to happen, and it just hasn't happened. Why not? So we keep running into this problem whereby, there's this just ineffectualness, of the international institutions that are supposed to exist to uphold and enforce international law. But when it comes to crimes committed by U.S. partners, it's really difficult to get anything to happen. And so, then it comes down to us essentially, because the only reason I think the prosecutor issued that statement was because of public pressure and public perception.
I
And
heard
so I think
Jocko.
we really do have all the power. And if these institutions are going to uphold their stated aims and their stated purposes, I mean, it's really up to us to create the conditions where that's the only politically feasible outcome.
I was just going to say, I heard Jocko Willink talking uh probably a year ago, maybe longer than that. It might have been a couple of years ago. And he was discussing the war on terror and America's failure in the war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan and why it drug on so long. And he said, look, man, with modern international rules for war and the Geneva Convention and all these operational rules that soldiers have to follow, the we don't have the I, I don't think he said heart, but I'm going to use the word heart because I can't think of a better way of describing what he was talking about. He said we don't have the heart to do what it takes to win a war, and therefore it just draws out over time because we're kind of like mealy mouth or half in, half out. We're not doing what it takes to win a war. War is not conducted in the same way it was prior to World War II. And I said whenever the attacks happened in Israel, when was that? October 7th, is that correct?
Yeah.
I had said that the what terrifies me is America didn't have the wherewithal and the the gall to do what it took to win in Afghanistan and to win in Iraq. But what terrifies me is that Israel does have the stomach for that kind of violence. And basically, like what I was telling people is we have to watch because it might come to a point where they just decide to kill all males of Palestinian descent. Just kill all the males, take in all the women as basically slaves, or as prisoners, and just kind of breed a new breed a new culture throughout the Palestinian bloodline by doing that, by getting rid of all the males in Gaza. Um, Luckily, we haven't seen that kind of, you know, determination, that type of violence that it would take, and that is so barbaric and so kind of what we would consider ancient.
Mhm.
But at the same time, the reason that it draws out and we have the kind of violence and we have the kind of displacement that we see today is partially because it's not a let's get in, do what we have to do to get rid of the threat and then get out. That's not the way that wars are fought nowadays. So there are benefits, but there are also downsides to this international law.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are constraints that are preventing Israel from, you hear this argument, well, how can it be genocide? I mean, only 40,000 Palestinians have died.
Mm,
As though there's some kind of threshold number that must be reached.
right.
And
Yeah.
everyone, anytime the word genocide comes up, everyone automatically thinks of, the Holocaust.
Hmm.
Um, but that's actually, if you look at the definition of genocide under international law, it's really about, the destruction of a people as a people.
Hmm.
So look at what Israel has been doing. It's been systematically targeting the healthcare system, systematically targeting the education system, systematically targeting Palestinian culture, like you mentioned,
Hmm.
destroying universities, museums, cultural, historical locations,
Hmm.
um, churches,
Yeah.
um, and so preventing women from being able to give birth to healthy
Hmm.
children,
Yeah.
using starvation as a method of warfare. I mean,
Hmm.
this all adds up to a genocidal campaign. Um, but didn't you hear the argument? Well, if it's not genocide, because if Israel wanted to commit genocide, it could just wipe out all of the Palestinians in Gaza in a matter of days, and it hasn't done that, and therefore it's not genocide. And so, well, okay, so there are constraints on what Israel is able to feasibly get away with
Hmm.
under the current system. And so that is a good thing. And so international law isn't stopping Israel from committing crimes, but it's more public perception is the constraint, is really the ultimate constraint. And so what it's really about is the need for the United States and the Israeli government to manage people's perceptions.
Right.
And so that's what it comes down to. And so they want, so I mean, yeah, I think if most Americans really understood the nature of the conflict and really understood what was happening on the ground, I think it would be over tomorrow. There would be an end to it because it just would not be politically feasible for it to persist. And the problem is that most of what people think they know about the conflict isn't true. And you have so many Americans who are like very supportive of Israel's genocide, not because sure you have a lot of sickos who are like, yeah, this is genocide. Great. Go just kill all the Palestinians. I mean, you have people like that. But I think mostly you have people who do have a moral conscience, and who think that, they know the difference between right and wrong, and they're still supporting this genocide. Why? Well, because they have been convinced that everything Israel does is self-defense. And Palestinian civilians are only ever die in Gaza because they're being used by Hamas as human shields. And yada yada, all this propaganda nonsense, but people really believe this stuff.
Hmm.
And so this is the problem. This is the problem, is that people believe all the lies and the deceptions that are designed to manipulate their opinions about things. And so this is why you have this long-standing U.S. government policy of supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. This persists precisely because of the propaganda manipulating public opinion in a way that renders it politically feasible for this policy to continue. And so this is why I'm talking about the need for like this bottom up,
Hmm.
forget the ICC, forget the ICJ. Like if those institutions are going to actually do anything effectual and do good and serve their stated purpose, it's really up to us to create the conditions for that to happen.
Right. Yeah. Basically, the people have to run cover for them and kind of democratically choose to hold Israel to account.
Yeah.
I've often said I've said it in the Libertarian Institute chat too. I've often said that the support for Israel will be the last cancer to get cut out of um, U.S. politics, and that it's I wouldn't say it's a lost cause because I appreciate the work that people like you and Scott do on subjects um, on Israel and foreign policy and war. But at the same time, when we're looking at the political landscape and you have Kamala Harris going to continue Joe Biden's policy on Israel and Donald Trump hugging the Israeli flag, not literally, but basically, it's kind of like, yeah, this is kind of what we're dealing with right now. This is what we're given, and there's not a way out of this that's immediately recognizable to us. That there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of money that's backing Israel, and so there have to be other things we look at, not because I don't want to look at Israel, but because it's just kind of what the way it is at the moment, right? It's like if you wake up in the morning and your car breaks down and you get a tow truck to come pick you up, and the tow truck breaks down on the way to the shop, and then the tow truck that's towing the tow truck also breaks down or gets a flat tire. You're kind of in a situation where it's just like, okay, it's just what it is today. That's just the way this day is going to go, and we just got to deal with it, right? And so sometimes you just have to deal with bad scenarios, and that's all we're given at the moment when it comes to Israel policy is bad scenarios, because there are things about like support for Israel I don't understand. So like if you look historically, prior to the end of World War II, the Nazi regime was actually trying to set up Israel as a state. And then the League of Nations, which became the United Nations, just continued their program and and basically kicked Palestinians off of their land and gave that same plot of land to the Israelis that the Nazis were working on. But nobody wants to look at it as a Nazi plot to create the land of Israel. They all look at it as this justified liberal, move, and so there are lots of things in history that you can look back on and you could say, well, I don't understand why this is how it is. But that's just the way it is sometimes. Sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean the if you look at the British government support for the Zionist project, I mean, there was something called the transfer agreement where the German government was supportive of the Zionist movement.
Mm-hmm.
The thinking being, well, we don't want Jews in Germany, so yeah, let them all go to Palestine. Well, it was very similar with the British government. I mean, the anti-Semitism was one of the reasons for Western government support for the Zionist project. And a real very illuminating indication of that was the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry, I think 1946. They've said right in there that the Western government supported the Zionist project because they said that Jews will find a welcome in Palestine, unlike what they can find elsewhere,
Right.
which was really kind of like a tacit acknowledgement of their own policies of like very strictly limiting the number of Jewish refugees from the Holocaust that they were willing to accept into their own countries. And so that was one reason. And the other two reasons for the Balfour Declaration were, number one, look who it was written to, it was written from Lord Arthur Balfour, the British foreign minister, to whom? To Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild,
Mm-hmm.
the famous banking family. And so one of the reasons was to get Jewish support to secure Jewish support for the war effort. And the other one was to basically establish a military foothold in the Middle East, primarily to protect Britain's interest in the Suez Canal. So it was all these, those were the three main reasons. It was Jewish support for the war effort, military foothold in the Middle East, and anti-Semitism. Those were the reasons for Western support. So it was very cynical for Western governments to support the Zionist project. And of course, it involved a violation of promises to support Arab independence from Ottoman rule. And again, like I said, the League of Nations mandate for Palestine actually violated its own charter. It was literally drafted by Zionists for the purpose of facilitating the Zionist project at great prejudice to the rights of the indigenous Arab population. As for the current election cycle, I don't see voting as the solution. Like you said, you have Kamala Harris, you have Donald Trump. Before Bobby Kennedy dropped out, he was very supportive in defending Israel's genocide in Gaza. I mean, there isn't an option, at least not a viable one. I mean, sure, you have Jill Stein is good on Palestine and opposing Israel's criminal violence. But in terms of any candidates, in this two-party system we have, there's this head of the beast and there's this head of the beast. And which one would you prefer devour you?
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to empower one head over the other. I want to slay the beast. And so, to me, the idea of voting is just completely ineffectual. It's never worked. I mean, we are where we are because people continue to believe that they have to vote for the lesser of two evils, because people don't vote these days for who they like. They just vote against who they dislike even more.
Mm-hmm.
And so this thinking is to me is just completely irrational and illogical, because voting for the lesser of evils is still voting for evil. And so I'm just saying, like, just stop voting for evil, stop perpetuating it, because all that does is it legitimizes the outcome, and it empowers whoever's in power, whoever's in office, to carry on with the agenda, which is typically there's marginal differences between the parties on major issues. The lockdown madness started under Trump.
Mm-hmm.
It was continued under Biden. The increased debt started under Trump. It continued under Biden. I mean, it's just the same. Every time there's a new person in power in the executive, in the White House, these policies just continue. The Israelis, the U.S. government support for Israel's crimes against Palestinians. It doesn't matter if it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. That policy just continues. The Federal Reserve System, the system of legalized counterfeiting, which exists to effect an upwards transfer of wealth from the poor and middle class to the 1%. It's legalized theft, legal plunder. And yet, and you don't hear anyone, it doesn't matter who is in office, that system continues. I mean, it's just like, if you look at the real big issues and the real big problems we're faced with, voting for a Democrat over a Republican, or vice versa, like, that's not the solution to the problem. It really isn't. And so if people could just get out of this mindset, I think, of thinking that they, like, that's what's required for them to have like some kind of effect and some kind of impact on society. I'm sorry, but casting a vote is not really affecting anything. All it's doing is perpetuating the existing power system. But I really do think we have all the power, because if we were just to stop legitimizing the criminal organization in Washington, D.C., then it would have no power. The criminal organization has its power because the American people give them that power. So just stop giving it that power. Stop giving this criminal regime our power. Stop giving our power away. That's kind of my perception. And so when I'm talking about, like this upward, bottom up kind of solution, I wasn't implying voting at all. I didn't mean that at all.
Oh yeah, yeah.
I mean, we need to be out there correcting all the misinformation. We need to be educating other people who are deluded, and they have a delusional viewpoint, and they have delusional perceptions of reality, because they're so inundated, they're so indoctrinated into the state religion, that they believe, when the government, when they hear, oh, Kamala Harris has been working tirelessly for a ceasefire in Gaza, it's like they'll believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, never, like, just completely disconnected from reality. And so, like, we just have to get through to these people, and like, and the ones who can actually handle, a lot of people like live in this bubble, and if you poke at their bubble, they just freak out and they can't deal with it and they can't handle it. And you're never going to get through to people who are just, it's like The Matrix is such a perfect analogy. That film, I mean, there are people who are just, they prefer to live in the Matrix,
Mm-hmm.
than in real life. But there are people who can be reached, and so we need to be trying to reach people who have a moral conscience, who are capable of thinking for themselves. They just generally don't do that because they don't know better, because they've just been so indoctrinated into the lies and the deceptions. But if we could, in my view, that we could reach a point where we reach a critical mass of like awakened population, that it would just become politically infeasible for the regime to continue its crimes.
Well,
Pick its crime, whatever the crime might be, in whatever area, the systematic violation of the right to informed consent, the criminal violence overseas, whatever issue it is, it would have to cease, because the government would no longer have the power to persist in those policies.
yeah, you brought up the Bible earlier, and the only thing I can think of is whenever in the Old Testament, when the Jews wanted a king, uh God had told them, like, you don't want this. This is
Yeah.
not the route you want to go.
Yes.
And we're
Yeah.
still living out the consequences of that decision, you know?
Yes, yes, yes. That's right. That's right.
And
Yeah, I mean,
so,
and yeah, you look at the whole, look at the New Testament and Jesus's whole message, and he was really anti-state.
oh yeah.
Come out of her, my people, Babylon the Great. I mean, what is the revelation like speaking to? It's speaking to government and the state and its violence and and its theft. Um, so yeah, that's a great point about you know Yahweh's warning to his people, like you don't want kings, and yet they would refuse to listen.
And yet he was murdered for being anti-revolutionary too, because he didn't he's like, I'm not a political revolutionary. That's not my task. And so
Yeah.
it's
Well, that's why he spoke in parables, so that only people who had the wherewithal to understand his coded message could pick up on what he was really saying. He was very
right.
careful. He wasn't out to try to like piss off the governing authorities.
Hmm.
At least not the state authorities. He didn't care about pissing off the religious authorities.
Yeah. Well, because they were the ones who were screwing everything up.
Yeah,
So, but
yeah. So he was.
so one of the things I wanted to ask about was the veto power. You brought up that there are 5 countries that have veto power. Which countries are these?
Let's see. It's the United States, Great Britain, France, Russia, and China.
Okay, and so how does this veto power work? Because I have heard that it's like every country will vote for something to go in a specific direction, and then one of these countries will be like, no, we're not doing that.
Yeah,
How is
yeah,
that? Like, how does that work? Is that like
yeah.
something to
That's
do with
just
the
it.
treaty or
Yeah, that's just the way the UN Charter is written, that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and there are non-permanent members of the Security Council, and there's a rotation. So, the other countries, the other members of the Security Council are just kind of on a rotation. And so it's kind of, they each get a chance at some point to be on the Security Council, but there's only the 5 permanent members. And if a resolution is up to a vote in the UN Security Council, it could be, I don't know how many members there are in total, but it could be all of the other members.
mm-hmm,
But if one of the 5 permanent members votes no,
mm-hmm.
then it doesn't pass.
And
Um,
okay, so you said it's Great Britain, France, US, China, and Russia.
yeah.
Okay. How is and this is kind of going off a little bit, but this is just my own curiosity. How is it that Russia is one of the members when they couldn't be accepted into NATO? Like, I don't, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, why are they okay for the UN Security Council, but they're not okay to be part of NATO?
Well, I think because the UN arising after World War II and in the Soviet, or the Soviet Union having been an allied power.
Oh, okay. So their role in World War
Yeah, they were just
II
kind of
kind of,
rolled in
they kind of
along with the
godfathered them in.
Allies
Gotcha.
into the system. I mean, I think if it was to be recreated today, probably Russia wouldn't be able to to get on board with it. But I think that's my guess is how that came to be. Um, but yeah, I mean, obviously, so you had these kind of opposing powers, but they were kind of considered the great powers. I mean, so obviously the US, France, and Great Britain were allied together. Um, and yeah, I think China was selected just because it was the big power in the East, right?
Hmm.
And the most populous.
Hmm.
So, but at the same time, it's like, well, why should those states have such superior power over all the others?
Mm.
And so it was really just this inequitable system to begin with that had this built-in bias and this built-in prejudice into it that inevitably resulted in the great powers being able to use international law as a weapon against other weaker states
Right.
while themselves being protected from it. And so, I mean, to me, that's the whole purpose of this world order and why it was created for that purpose, to enable the larger, more powerful states to essentially weaponize international law against the weaker states and to perpetuate this world order.
Yeah, because you would think that as soon as they were done with the trials against the Germans, right, that the next thing they were going to investigate, excuse me, would have been the dropping of the atomic bomb.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so based upon the rules that they laid out, you would think, we probably need to take a look at, these actions that were
Nobody
taken.
was prosecuted for the firebombing of Dresden,
Right.
you know. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, it was really applied. I mean, international law that was largely established as a result of the atrocities of World War II. Um, yeah, obviously Germans were prosecuted, but Western government officials who committed similar crimes, not to the extent of the Holocaust, but yeah, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Dresden, and so on. Um, they weren't prosecuted, and so yeah, this is a good example of what I mean of how that there are powerful states, countries, governments that essentially are unaccountable under the current system.
Well, we're seeing it on a micro level too, right? You see how Donald Trump is prosecuted for things that every politician does. It's like, oh, okay, and it's just weird because you're like, all right, that's odd because so many, like, Biden has done, et cetera, whether it's, top secret, documents that he is taken or whatever, and they're prosecuting Trump, but they're not prosecuting Biden. It's kind of this strange kind of like dichotomy they got going on. And it just opens your eyes. Like it's been weird to me that ever since the ICJ came out and declared that Israel was violating international law, everybody stopped calling Putin a war criminal. It just stopped. They were just all just shut up. They're like, okay, we can't go there anymore, because then that kills that gives away the game that we're playing.
Well, Biden had described Russia's actions in Ukraine as genocide,
Yeah, yeah.
which is just totally incomparable to the situation in Israel. I mean, more children were killed in the first 3 weeks of Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Gaza than in all other conflicts combined
Hmm.
for each of the years of, I think it was 2020, 21, 2022. Um, I mean, it just the indiscriminate massacring of civilians is just unprecedented,
Hmm.
um, since probably World War II. And yeah, so on one hand, so there's that double standard. Yeah, so what Russia is doing in Ukraine is a genocide, but we're going to support Israel with what it's doing in Gaza, even though by any measure it's incomparably worse,
Right.
and incomparably more criminal. And so yeah, it's kind of like you have this hypocrisy, and yeah. I mean, it's I don't know that they're necessarily going to be shut up by the
Well,
fact that the
I just haven't
ICJ,
heard him. I haven't heard him talking
yeah.
about Russia committing war crimes since the ICJ determined that Israel was committing war
It,
crimes. It's
it
like
probably it probably
everybody.
has an effect of at least tamping down their rhetoric.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I
and
think it has this effect on like kind of limiting the extremeness of their rhetoric. Yeah.
right. You had
Because they
brought
can't say, yeah. At
you
this
had said
point, if
that
Biden were to come out and describe what Russia is doing as genocide in Ukraine, like the backlash from that would be
people would be like,
right.
wait.
I mean, back then he could say it, but now it'd be like people would see right through that and see like,
Right.
well, wait a minute now.
Yeah.
If that's a genocide, then
Then what's happening over here?
and that's another point is that, theoretically, not that it's likely to happen, but Biden and other U.S. government officials could very well be prosecuted by the ICC for complicity in genocide, for complicity in crimes against humanity. because under the 1948 Genocide Convention, not only is perpetrating the crime of genocide prohibited, of course, which is also just customary international law, but facilitating a genocide
Mhm.
and acting complicitly in supporting a genocide is prohibited.
Right.
It's a violation of the convention, which of course both Israel and the U.S. are parties to that convention. Um, and everything in the convention rises to the level of customary international law anyway, so it doesn't matter whether they're a party to the treaty or not. But so U.S. government officials could be prosecuted. Again,
Yeah,
not that
because that
that's
was an
likely to happen.
excuse. That was an excuse they were using at one point when ICJ first came out, and they were saying, well, Israel isn't part of the ICJ, but Russia is. So therefore, the ICJ's determination on Russia matters, but it doesn't matter when it's Israel because Israel isn't part of the ICJ. And I was like, well, that's weird. Aren't they holding the same metrics to investigate both, both parties? But apparently, whether or not you adhere to the ICJ's ruling determines whether or not it's effective on you.
Yeah, so like the Israel would reject the ICJ's jurisdiction.
Right.
So Israel is a UN member, as a member of the UN, and the ICJ is a UN body. So it's not that Israel is not there's not really necessarily members of the ICJ system. It's more that Israel has rejected the ICJ's jurisdiction
Gotcha.
over its relations with the Palestinians, arguing that, well, this is a bilateral issue. It doesn't involve the international community.
Yeah.
And the ICJ, in its recent ruling that the occupation itself is illegal, addressed that argument and pointed out that, well, actually, it does involve the international community and has involved the international community since before the state of Israel even existed. Look at the when the Zionists unilaterally declared the existence of the state of Israel on May 14th, 1948, what did they cite as legal authority? UN Resolution 181, the
Yeah.
General Assembly Partition Plan resolution, which, importantly, neither partitioned Palestine nor conferred any legal authority to the Zionists for that unilateral declaration. But this is, just demonstrative of the role of the international community in creating Israel in the first place. Going back to the League of Nations Palestine mandate. So the ICJ was just like, well, it's just absurd to argue that this conflict does not involve the international community. It always has from the very start. And so they
Well,
just, of
it
course,
didn't that
rejected that.
argument
Yeah.
wouldn't that argument be defunct whenever they involved Iran and Syria into the conflict? Now, because now it's becoming a broader war.
Well, sure, that too. Yeah, I mean, it risks spilling over outside of the borders of Israel Palestine, into the region. So of course it affects the international community. We can see that already it has. So yeah, it was an absurd argument from Israel, but
Hmm.
like that's kind of the best type of argument that they can come up with to try to block the ICJ from even hearing the case. Um, and of course it had other objections, but the ICJ reasoned through those arguments and came to the conclusion that, well, no, Israel's arguments are factually or logically in error, and here's the reality of the situation. And so it was a good ruling. It was really a positive development to see the ICJ coming. And this one was brought before the ICJ on the legal consequences of Israel's persistent occupation was brought before the court by the General Assembly. So the General Assembly requested this advisory opinion. This is a separate case from South Africa's case against Israel for genocide, which is still ongoing.
Hmm.
So just to clarify that, there's a couple of different cases there. But it was kind of a historic ruling for essentially in another significant another one of the more the significance of the ICJ ruling is it essentially repudiated the entire framework for the U.S.-led so-called peace process
When
because the
Oh, go ahead.
because the peace process was grounded on a rejection of the applicability of international law to the conflict. Because the U.S. had accepted Israel's unilateral interpretation of UN Security Council Resolution 242, which was passed in the wake of the 1967 war, which started on the morning of June 5th with a surprise Israeli attack on Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And so in Resolution 242, the Security Council, emphasizing the principle of international law that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible, called on Israel to withdraw its forces from the territories it occupied during that war, which were the Syrian Golan Heights, the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. So it called on Israel to return to the positions it held pre-June 5th, which
Mm-hmm.
were the 1949 armistice lines, sometimes called the Green Line, because that's the color it was drawn with on the map, and sometimes known as the 1967 lines. These are all synonymous. They all refer to the armistice lines. So that was what the Security Council did with UN Resolution 242. But Israel has its own unilateral interpretation where it says, well, it doesn't require us to completely withdraw. We can keep some of the territory, which is completely incompatible with both the principle emphasized in the preambulatory section of that resolution, and also completely contrary to the explicitly stated intent of the Security Council, if you go back to the meeting records.
Yeah.
And so, but that's the interpretation that the U.S. accepted as the basis for the peace process, was Israel's interpretation, not the Security Council's intent. And so this was the underlying deception of the entire peace process, whereby, so under the peace process, the framework was that the people living under this belligerent occupation had to negotiate with their oppressors over how much of their own land they could keep and potentially, maybe someday, exercise some kind of limited autonomy over.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a complete rejection of the applicability of international law to the conflict, whereas the two-state solution, premised on the actual meaning of UN Resolution 242, is premised on the applicability of international law to the conflict. And so, I mean, that's what we need. We need for international law to be applied to the situation and to be enforced, and for there to be accountability. And that is the problem, is that there is no accountability. And primarily when it comes to Israel, the reason for that is because of the US's support for its crimes against the Palestinians, and its willingness to use its power in the international community and in the UN organization to protect Israel.
You had mentioned earlier that people reject the idea that this is a genocide in Gaza because it's not the Holocaust. But if I look historically at genocides, the Holocaust was like kind of a one-off. It was just that was a complete oddity. And this like is much more similar to like the Armenian genocide. So could you explain via international law how we should be interpreting the idea of genocide, how the Armenian genocide and this kind of reflect each other?
Yeah, so a lot of people hear the term genocide, and they just think of, mass killing of civilians, and they kind of think of it in terms of some kind of threshold of numbers of civilians killed. And again, if you look at the 1948 Genocide Convention, which defines genocide, it has nothing to do with like a certain threshold being reached in terms of numbers or proportion of civilians killed. And we can look at in the situation in Gaza, and it's minimally 40,000 people have been killed, primarily civilians. I mean, if you look at the proportions, what would you expect if Israel was bombing indiscriminately? Well, you would expect the proportion of women and children killed to be roughly equivalent to the proportion of the population in Gaza that is women and children,
Mm-hmm.
which is exactly what we see. About 70% of the deaths among Palestinians have been women and children. Why? Because Israel's bombing indiscriminately, and so on and so forth. But so it's not about a certain proportion or a certain number of civilians killed. That's not the definition of genocide. It's about the destruction of a people as a people. And so what happened in Armenia, the Turkish forces attempted to destroy the Armenians as a people. with their mass expulsion and forced march and the resulting, um, massive deaths of Armenian peoples. And so, again, we can just look at the actual definition under international law of what a genocide is. And it comes down to this, like if what Israel is doing does not meet that definition of genocide, then that definition is completely pointless and irrelevant and meaningless. And so you have the situation where the ICJ is being asked to issue a determination of whether this is genocide. And if it comes back with a ruling that no, what Israel is doing does not meet the definition of genocide under the convention, it's going to know that it is essentially giving every country the green light to commit mass atrocities on an incredible scale. And so the ICJ is in this position where it's going to know that it cannot come away with a ruling like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's kind of a unique situation where, I've seen like Norman Finkelstein, who I greatly respect and admire, he had actually predicted that the ICJ back in January would, I forget his exact prediction, but I think he was surprised, and it was contrary to his prediction that the ICJ came away with a ruling preliminary. It issued preliminary measures ordering Israel to essentially to demonstrate its commitment to its obligations under the 1948 Genocide Convention, and ruled that South Africa had made a plausible case that Israel is committing genocide. So essentially, the ICJ ruled that Israel is committing a plausible genocide.
Mm-hmm.
And that surprised Norman Finkelstein, but it didn't surprise me. I differed from his analysis in that regard because I foresaw that happening, because my thinking was there's no way that they're going to come back with a ruling in response to the South Africa's request for preliminary measures. There's no way they're going to come back and just dismiss that request and say, oh, South Africa hasn't established the grounds for the ICJ to issue preliminary orders and measures to protect the civilian population in the meantime. Because South Africa's argument in that situation was, well, the civilian population in Palestine, in Gaza, can't wait for years for the ICJ to come to a decision on this. Like,
Mm-hmm.
we need some action now. The ICJ needs to issue some preliminary orders now to try to stop this. And that was based on, and South Africa's argument was, and we don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Israel is violating the Genocide Convention. All we have to do is make a plausible case that this is genocide. And the ICJ agreed. South Africa made a plausible case. And so that's why it issued the preliminary orders. So that to me was, indicative of the situation that the ICJ sees itself in. And of course, the U.S. opposes all of this and dismissed the ICJ's ruling and just basically dismisses the whole case. But I don't foresee the ICJ ruling in Israel's favor on this.
So,
because if they were to do that, it would basically render the 1948 Genocide Convention completely meaningless.
a few years ago, I'm trying to think of exactly when this was, because my wife's South African, so we kind of peripherally kind of keep up with South African politics, at least somewhat. A few years ago, the United Nations had determined that there was the potential. Uh, it was like it. I guess there are levels to genocide. You would probably know more about that than me, but there are levels to their ratings of genocide, and they had determined that South Africa was committing a genocide on white farmers in South Africa, and it was like the beginning stages of genocide. And so there are going to be a lot of people that say, what right does South Africa have to make this determination about Israel when they have their own domestic issues occurring on their soil? So where does South Africa get the authority to make this ruling and call in the ICJ for an investigation?
I'm sorry, you broke up there for a second. What was the question?
Oh, I was asking how does South Africa have this authority
Mm.
to call in the ICJ on an investigation against Israel?
Yeah, so any member state, UN member state, can bring a case before the ICJ against any other member state.
Okay.
And the ICJ could rule that, well, it might be possible, like Israel tried to argue that the ICJ has no jurisdiction in this matter. So, it has to, as long as it has jurisdiction, um, and as long as the case presented is plausible and well reasoned, then any state can do that. And so South Africa, just as a member of the UN, brought this case before the ICJ. Um, and so that's the situation. As for that argument, I mean, I have seen that. I don't follow South Africa politics. There's just too much else going on, both at
Yeah,
home and
and no,
abroad,
I
for
agree.
me to focus my mind on, and
My
there's just not enough
father-in-law
time in
still
the day.
lives there, so
Yeah, understood. Like my wife's from Taiwan, and I don't follow Taiwanese politics very closely either.
right.
It's just there's too much else for me to focus on, that it's just opportunity costs, right?
Yeah.
There's only so much time. Um, but so I don't know about that situation and can't comment on it, whether that's the case or not, and whether that's a reasonable argument that what's happening there is genocidal or not. Um, it very well might be. Let's just assume that that's the case, and that South Africa is demonstrating hypocrisy by bringing this case before the ICJ. Well, okay. It's still good that they did it. I mean, I think it was the South Africa government's number one. If South Africa were committing genocide domestically, if the government was bringing this case before the ICJ, would only harm its own interest in that regard.
Hmm.
It could only result in a backlash against South Africa for having done that, and it place a target on itself for having done that. But I think what the government of South Africa did was really heroic. I mean, really brilliant and heroic. And the case they presented was just phenomenal. Like, it was so well argued and so well reasoned, that I applaud the government of South Africa for standing up and doing that. And it brought the case back in December of 2023. And the ICJ issued its preliminary order, its first one, in January 26th, 2024. And so, if there is hypocrisy there, then the government of South Africa is essentially placed a target on its own back by bringing this case forth.
To be fair, probably three or 4 years ago, they did get rid of Jacob Zuma as the head of the ANC, and have brought in Ramaphosa, who seems to be doing a better job as a president of South Africa. Because in South Africa, you don't vote for a person, you vote for a party,
Mm-hmm.
and then the party appoints the head of the party as. So that's the way it works
Yeah.
there. So with Zuma being outed, now he started a new party and he's causing all kinds of other issues. So I don't know what all's going on there at the moment. But yeah, I was just asking because I have heard people talk about, well, South Africa doesn't have any room to talk. They have their own domestic issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And
Yeah.
that's like saying my neighbor is a shitbag, and he didn't have the right to call the cops on me for beating my wife in the front yard or something like that,
Right. Right. Right.
So
Yeah, exactly. That's
it's
exactly
kind of
it.
one of these weird arguments that people will make and are making. So I just wanted to get that out there.
Yep.
Otherwise, I don't really have anything else on the subject. Do you have anything we didn't cover that you just want to make sure is said?
No, I think basically, to summarize, yeah, the number one, the institution of statehood itself is something that anyone who believes in the non-aggression principle ought to oppose, because the logical corollary of non-aggression is that institutions grounded in the threat or use of force to achieve aims is a violation of the principle. And so we ought to oppose states. And so you have this ruling system of states. The institution of statehood is unfortunately the way the world works. And so you have these organizations like the UN that essentially are designed to empower the strong against the weak, and it's totally an inequitable situation. But at the same time, we ought to appreciate that there is international law, that states have engaged in essentially contractual agreements with each other to try to limit their ability to commit crimes against each other, such as wars and wars of aggression, and crimes against civilians who have nothing to do with the violence and aren't participating in the combat. Um, and so the problem isn't that international law exists. The problem is that international law isn't enforced. And if it is enforced, it's not enforced equally. And so it really is up to, I think, again, up to us to affect the paradigm shift required for it to become politically infeasible for this system itself to be continued, and for the crimes to persist with impunity.
Hmm.
And so I think it's a matter of educating ourselves and then helping others become de-indoctrinated. Like I had to de-indoctrinate myself from a lot of what I was taught in the public school system and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
It's a matter of, first of all, understanding who might be possible to reach, and recognizing the difference between people who, it doesn't matter what the facts are, they're going to believe what they believe, and you're just never going to reason with them. But then, finding those people who are capable of reason and kind of getting through to them and helping them to see how they've been lied to and deceived.
Hmm.
And if we can reach that critical mass of independent thought and awakened citizenry, then we can affect real change. And it's not going to happen by casting a vote and legitimizing the system. It's going to happen by rejecting that system and just kind of making it happen on our own. I mean,
Yeah,
that's my opinion.
it's amazing the journey that just seeking truth will bring you on.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's wild because you're like it'll drag you in all kinds of directions before you actually start getting down the right path. It's pretty crazy. But hey, man,
Yep.
plug anything you got to plug. I know you've been active writing, and I think you just released a blog post yesterday.
Yeah, I'm trying to get word out on various issues as I can. Lately, making time for just even writing has been difficult. Even just trying to keep up with all the information is tough. But I do my best to try to get information out as much as I can. So yeah, if people are interested in my work and want to stay up to date with my writings, head to jeremyrhammond.com, sign up for my newsletters. And also, listeners of this show and viewers will probably be interested in my book, Obstacle to Peace. I've got a number of smaller books on the topic of Israel-Palestine, but the Obstacle to Peace is my magnum opus on the topic. The subtitle being the U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And it essentially covers, a lot of what I've been referring to and talking about of the U.S. government's longstanding policy of supporting Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. But it also, um, it kind of focuses more contemporary on more contemporary issues from from the establishment of the peace process through the Obama administration. But it goes back historically to provide all the necessary background context as necessary to understand those then current events. The book was published in 2016, but of course is every bit as relevant today as it was the day I published it. So definitely check out my book, Obstacle to Peace. And again, just go to jeremyrhammond.com and sign up for my newsletters.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely get the book, Obstacle to Peace. I'm going to be purchasing that. So, all right. Well, I'm going to stop the recording. I appreciate you coming on, man.
Thanks, Tommy.